While everyone is finding your seat, go ahead and turn your Bibles also to Nehemiah chapter 4. And today we will cover verses 15 to verse 23 of Nehemiah chapter 4. And just to get us situated, somewhat reminding everyone what we discussed last week, I mentioned during the sermon that God, much like any good builder, always wants to measure and evaluate the progress of what he is building. And even though he definitely was involved in the endeavor of building the walls were his walls as much as the Jews' walls. The most important thing that he was building, it was actually his people. And here, we will continue with this train of thought, understanding that the story is just reaching a point where this is actually going to be even more relevant for the purposes of God, again, building up his people. Now, last week, there were a few challenges that we noticed, 3 of them specifically. Initially, we saw in the text that there was a lot of mockery and contempt against the Jews. And somehow Nehemiah heard about all of this and was upset. But instead of focusing upon the enemy, he prayed to God. He noticed that even though he was being affected by this mockery, first and foremost, they were mocking him. Eventually, we saw another challenge, and it had to do with a conspiracy to disturb the work. And the response was prayer in addition to watchfulness, day and night. Now they were being very cautious and watchful, just waiting and being prepared because they knew that the enemies could attack at any time. Eventually, we saw another challenge. It was actually a continuation of the previous one, where there was not only this external attack and plot, but there was also an internal attack. Some of the Jews, they felt a little bit discouraged because they had worked so very hard and the walls were only halfway built. And you add to that, again, the plots that the enemies were having against them, and now you had a twofold attack, if you will. But once more, the response was very positive. And every time we had this positive response, you can think of God measuring their growth. And here you have this evolution of their faith, of their dedication to God, of their willingness to sacrifice of themselves, knowing that there was a purpose to all of this. And most importantly, the purpose was, in fact, the glory of God. Now, everything that we saw last week had to do with the measuring of their growth based on the response to these challenges. But God, he is actually very dynamic. There's not only one way to measure growth. And what is interesting about the text that we will cover this week is that not only does God measure the growth of his people in relationship to how they deal with adversity, he also measures growth based on how his people deal with triumph as well. And that's somewhat counterintuitive, because understanding that we are measured when we are challenged with adversity, and if we have a positive response or reaction, then it shows growth, that's, understandable. That's pretty easy to see. But often God also measures our growth based on how we respond to triumphs. So let's see how exactly this works out. Again, let's read from verse 15 to verse 23 of chapter 4. And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. So it was from that time on that half my servants worked at construction, while the other half held spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor. And the leaders were behind all the house of Judah, those who built the wall, and those who carry burdens, loaded themselves, so that with one hand they worked at construction, and with the other held a weapon. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Verse 19. Then I said to the nobles, the rulers, the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us, there our God will fight for us. So we labored in the work, and half of the men held spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. At the same time, I also said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who follow me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off for washing. So initially, the information here is very positive. If you recall, the Jews, led by Nehemiah, they heard that there was a plot from the enemies to attack. And most likely that was due to the fact that somehow the enemies noticed that some of the Jews, they were feeling kind of tired. They were feeling kind of desperate. They did not think possibly that they could finish the work, so that was a great strategic time to attack. But Nehemiah countered that by plotting and organizing a defense. So they were there, they stopped the work for a while, and they were just waiting for these enemies to come and to attack. When the enemies came, they saw the Jews prepared for battle, prepared to defend their city and their walls. And because they saw this, what did they do? Did they continue? No. They stopped on their tracks and they went back home. Again, this was a great result. I don't know if they expected this type of victory, but it was a very noticeable and distinct victory. The enemies stopped in their tracks and went back when they saw that the Jews were ready for battle. And what the interesting thing that we see here right off the bat is that the Jews didn't really celebrate this victory. You notice that they weren't just happy being prepared for battle. They weren't satisfied with just frustrating their enemies' plans. That was not sufficient. And just seeing the enemy retreat, that was not the end to them, because literally, quite literally, what did they do? They went back to work. Isn't that interesting? No celebration, no partying, no high fives, no let's take a break. We've had a tough week. We had to, reorganize our daily tasks. No. Let's get back to work. Now, I believe that they understood one very important thing about what was happening here. In fact, this was a victory. This was a great achievement. But this was a victory. It was not the victory. This was a victory within a battle. But the war still raged on. And because they understood that the war still raged on and the victory was great, but it was just one battle, they needed to go back to work because that was the purpose of it all. And this is very poignant because, again, we're going back to this idea that God was measuring their growth, and we had already seen that they were growing based on the response of these challenges, but now we see growth based on their response to triumph. They remained watchful. They did not take a break. Even though they were triumphant, they continued to work. And that was growth. Why was this growth? Because the Jews, based on their history, this is definitely a lesson they needed to learn. It comes to mind a story, and it's a story that we are all pretty familiar with, when the Jews, the Hebrews technically, they were being guided by Moses to leave Egypt. Eventually, the leadership transitioned from Moses to Joshua when they entered into the promised land of Canaan. And Joshua's main obligation was that of a general, because they needed to conquer these city-states that were in the promised land. And Joshua was a great leader, and he did a wonderful job at leading the army of the Jews, or the Hebrews, to attack and conquer these city-states. And when you look at Joshua chapter 6, you see the first of these battles. What was the first of these battles? It was initially the city-state of Jericho. And like in many other times when they were preparing to go into battle, they would send spies to figure out how hard it would be to attack a different type of people. So they sent spies, and that's when you have the story of Rahab. We all kind of know how that worked out, and the spies came back, and everything was kind of being organized. And then God spoke to Joshua by saying, look, here's what you will do. This is a huge city. It was an extremely fortified, fortress-like city. I want you to lead the people to walk around the walls of Jericho. For 6 days, you will do that once, every single day, sound the trumpets. But on the 7th day, you will do something different. On the 7th day, instead of walking around once, you will walk around 7 times, and by then, not only will you sound the trumpets, but everyone will shout. And once everyone shouts, the walls will come tumbling down. And they did all of that. They followed this tactic perfectly. But God added to this information. And he said, look, some of the precious metals, you will gather them and you will keep it in the Lord's treasury. But everything else needs to be destroyed. You will not take these private spoils. So those were the guidelines, those were the rules, and they followed them almost perfectly. Unfortunately, one man did not follow these rules. Achan was his name, and he took some of these spoils for himself. Now, the interesting portion of this story is what comes in chapter 7. Because again, the Jews were extremely successful. They were victorious in battle, and this was a huge challenge. Jericho, interestingly enough, because of its walls, it was like a fortress. When the citizens, the inhabitants of Jericho, saw these Jews walking around the walls, they must have thought that they were crazy. What are you doing just walking around the walls? It's going to be impossible. This is like a fortress. Well, by the end of the week, it was all in rumbles. And they were able to go into the city and destroy it completely. And now the next city over was this little tent city of Ai. Comparatively speaking, it was nothing. And it's even interesting because as they had done before, they sent out spies. Before they attacked Ai, they sent out spies. And then when the spies came back, they said, look, we don't need to bother all the men. They are nothing compared to Jericho. Just get a couple of thousand men and this should be no problem. Well, what happened? They were defeated. And then Joshua was there just grumbling, distraught, saddened. And God told Joshua, what are you doing? Get up. There was a person who sinned. Find who that person is, deal with the problem, and move on. But this story is a great story to illustrate the fact that in their past, the Jews were not diligent after a victory. They were not watchful. And that's a huge measuring stick. And this was definitely a teaching moment in their history. You know what teaching moments are, right? Parents, especially dads. So if you don't know what teaching moments are, it's basically like this. You see a little child, and maybe he or she, they're playing with the paper clip, some type of metal object. And slowly but surely, they get close to an outlet, and you see a hole there, and you see your parents sticking stuff in there, so you want to do it as well. And you, dads, mostly, you're watching that, and you're inclined to go and save the day, save them from themselves. But like a good dad, you think, well, maybe this can be a teaching moment, because I can save him or her from herself or himself, but maybe I'm going to have to do this over and over again. But if they get that one shock, that is a lifelong lesson. And they do it, and they get shocked, and never again, hopefully, will they do that. And here I think it was something similar happening because God was noticing everything that was going on, and he, quote unquote, allowed that to happen because it was just so horrifying. How can we be victorious in this great battle against this fortified city that had these great, thick, large walls, and then just the next week over be defeated by these nobodies? How can this be possible? Do you know how that is possible? When you are not watchful after a victory, you are setting yourself up for great failure. Watchfulness needs to be a lifelong process, regardless of what is happening. When challenges come, you need to be watchful because the enemies are at hand. But oftentimes we struggle after the challenges pass, and we have a time of peace, a time of victory, and then we let our guard down, setting ourselves up for failure. But here we do not see this, which is great because it leads me to believe that they had learned from their history, learned from their past, and even though, again, they had won the battle, they knew that the war still raged on and they would not be caught off guard. So what did they do? Again, they remained watchful. And the text here continues from verse 16 to verse 23, just literally stating how they were watchful. Initially, from verse 16 to verse 18, there is mention of Nehemiah's servants. Most likely, these are the same guards that Artaxerxes lent to Nehemiah on his way to Jerusalem. They were still there with him. And verse 16 and verse 18 basically states there that Nehemiah split them in half. One half worked on the wall, and then the other half, they were stationed in various places around the wall, and they were holding weapons in case they were needed. So initially, again, Nehemiah was just organizing his personal guard, his private servants. But the other people also did similar things. They were very watchful, and they work while being attentive to these dangers. But Nehemiah and the people, they had an issue to deal with. Because as mentioned before, as seen before, Nehemiah being a great organizer and leader of men, he understood that everybody could not be in the same place in the wall because that's kind of too many cooks in the kitchen. You will not be able to achieve a lot of progress if everyone is in the same portion of the wall. So what did he do? He divided up these people into families because of geographic locations, because of professions, because the works just needed to be done. We've seen this before. And they were all surrounding the walls and working in particular locations. Well, that is a great strategy for building, but not for defense. A defensive strategy is what? Everyone in the same place. Numbers matter. So what did Nehemiah do? He said, okay, we will continue to work. You will continue to be spread around the walls, but I'm going to set up an alarm system. As soon as you hear the trumpets, drop what you're doing and come rushing back so we can defend the walls, so we can defend our city. And here you have something that they might not have done before, which is potentially why this hadn't been accomplished for 100 years. Because it was not work or watchfulness. It was work while being watchful. Maybe they had tried working before and it didn't work. Maybe they had tried being watchful before and it wasn't successful. Potentially because they were not doing both of these at the same time. Again, it was not a matter of or, it was being able to do both at the same time. The text also tells us that they dedicated themselves even more to the task at hand. They were even more diligent. There was this greater sense of urgency. How do we see this? Because they were working night and day. They would stay on guard at night, and they would work during the day. And they were working hard already, so now the effort was being doubled. Even mentions here that at times, for a period of time, they didn't even change their clothes. Why? Because they were utilizing, or they were following that idiom. Do you know that idiom, not getting caught with your pants down? Great saying, and it really does illustrate what is happening here. They were so diligent. They were so watchful. They were so prepared that Nehemiah plainly states that they kept their clothes on, their work clothes on, their battle clothes on all of the time because they did not want to get caught with their pants down. And the effort continued. Again, not work or watchfulness, both at the same time. And God was measuring. And he was seeing their growth. And now it's all positive. Eventually in the story, we will see certain negative things, which is normal of human beings. But up until this point, I believe that God was pleased with their growth, with their progress. Again, these people who were not a people for a very long time because they were taken captive, now after all of this time, generations and generations, now they are rebuilding. They are once again becoming a nation. They are still God's people, and they are evolving in accordance to his standard. And there are a couple of things that I want to make note of here. things that are appropriate for us to utilize for our own personal evaluation. The first thing that I see here, which is appropriate for our personal analysis, is the idea that for a while, the Jews did stop working. Again, the transition from what we saw last week to what we begin to see this week, essentially they were ready for battle, so they stopped working, and then when the enemies came, they saw them and they said, oh, let's go back. This is not going to end well. So they were ready for battle, but once the battle ended, and the battle ended before it even started, but then they went back to work. And the reason why I find this is good for our personal analysis is it's because I've actually quite literally seen this happen in the church. What have I seen happening in the church? I've seen people who are very gung-ho, who are quite militant, who are ready for battle in the church. And they are quite good at it. Whatever issue is happening, and they are there in the front lines. And they fight. They fight for a good cause. Again, they're very diligent because at that particular time, it is appropriate to battle. It is appropriate to fight and to defend. But that is not normal church life. That is not the constant obligation. Because the battle eventually ends. And my critique is this. Oftentimes, when those who are very much ready for battle, when the victory is achieved and the battle is over, now that normal life once again begins, they don't want to work. They just want to battle. They just want to fight. They just want to defend. But once it's over and everything is said and done and work needs to be done, normal church work, then they have a very hard time dealing with that obligation. So this serves as our initial encouragement. If need be ready to take arms. But that is not the constant. Those battles can be won and lost. But in between, you have normal church life. Things that are even quite ordinary, yet important. That needs to be done, and we need to be able to do both of them. And oftentimes, at the same time, not choosing one or the other, but both. And in addition to that, pertaining to the Jews' ability to understand the difference between a victory and the victory, this is also important for our personal evaluation and analysis. Once more, it was a great victory. It was an awesome victory. Can't you just see yourselves there in front line, and you're kind of nervous, you're anxious because you don't know what to expect. And then you see the enemies coming. And then as soon as they catch the sight of you being prepared for battle, instead of engaging, they actually retreat. What a joyful sight. But it was just a battle. The war was still happening. And they understood that the war would not end until the work was done. Again, life is full of battles. Some of these battles you will be victorious. Some of them not so much. You win some and you lose some. That is the natural part of life. That's usually what happens. Hopefully you're more victorious than not, but you win some and lose some. But you continue because you know that those are limited to that time period, but the war still remains until the work is done. For them, the work was the wall. But what is it for us? There's an interesting text in Philippians chapter 1 when Paul essentially says that he is very confident that he who begun that good work on us, on you, will complete it. When will he complete it? Until the day of Jesus Christ. Do you see how that matches? One day the work will be completed. And Paul, again, he was very sure of that. He was also sure that that day had not come yet. The great builder in the sky was diligently working on his people. It was him. And he would complete it eventually. Then the war is over. Then the building project is done. But until that day, we work on. No early retirement. You can take a vacation every once in a while, but be diligent about going back to work. Take a break if need be, but continue. Do what needs to be done. And as we progress, understanding that the work is not done, once again, God is essentially doing the work, and we know that he wants to complete it, and he is measuring us, and he is evaluating our growth. And our growth, once more, can be evaluated in two ways pertaining to the text that we see here. How we deal with triumphs as much as how we deal with challenges. So the next time you have a great triumph, keep watch. Because Sunday may be a blessing, but Monday is right around the corner. Amen?